I think most of you know who I am. I'm Vince Gennaro, the SABR president and the head of the Tisch Institute for Global Sport at NYU, where I run 3 degree programs, 450 students, some of which are here today. So I've been deeply interested in the whole topic of pitch sequencing for some time, as I'm sure any baseball analyst is. Really, it's such a central element of the game, how pitchers set up hitters, how pitchers approach strategically a plate appearance, how hitters respond to those, and so forth. So I set out to try to do some things. My ambitions were greater than what was probably feasible. So what I had conceived as a study, got limited in some ways by the practicality of both the data, the systems, and so forth. But nonetheless, I think I began to scratch the surface on this topic and found some interesting things that I wanted to share. So my objective was to measure the impact of the previous pitch on the outcome of a pitch. Love to have done 3-pitch, 4-pitch sequences. Love to have looked at bat to at bat and the experience factor within a game. But really, again, in terms of biting off what you can chew, I really just said, let's look at outcomes on a pitch, and let's look at the previous pitch. So the key issues I was addressing is the relative impact of those two. The previous pitch versus the current pitch. And I did it on batted ball outcomes, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What characteristics of the previous pitch are most relevant in explaining the outcomes? Are there pitchers that you would say the data suggests that they are primarily sequencers? In other words, the outcome of their current pitch is highly dependent on what they did previously, the previous pitch? And alternatively, are there pitchers who that's not really much of a factor? I mean, you can really get much of the explanatory power of what happened on an outcome from the pitch itself. So the data set I used was the 2012 to 2018 StatCast data set. I looked at all pitches that resulted in balls in play, except for first pitch balls in play, because there was no previous pitch. So the first thing you realize here is that what I did not include were perhaps one of the most positive outcomes for a pitcher of sequencing, which is either called strikes or swinging strikes. So again, look at this as one little vein into a complex problem of the value of pitch sequencing. But I excluded, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, looking at swinging strikes or called strikes. So I just looked at batted ball outcomes. And I analyzed it at the pitcher level. So I looked at individual pitchers who had a certain threshold of pitch pairs that resulted in balls in play. And then I tend to like to look at things by handedness. So I looked at the four possibilities of handedness as you see up there: left-handed hitter, left-handed pitcher, et cetera. So I played around with a number of, and by the way, I should say I had some wonderful help from data scientists over at NYU on this, and so I played around with things like the run value of the outcome, the launch angle of the outcome. In the end, we ultimately singularly used exit velocity of the batted ball, the balls in play. So that is the singular variable. What we tried to do was find a way to take that continuous variable and integrate into it swinging strikes and called strikes. And by the way, are they equal in value? Or is a swinging strike a better outcome than a called strike for a pitcher? But the point is, we couldn't come up with a way, and I'm sure some of the people in this room have ideas on how to do this, but we couldn't come up with a great way of integrating a discrete variable like swinging strikes into this continuous flow of batted ball exit velocity. You know, one of the ideas I had that the data scientists were not too fond of was to just take the exit velocity that represented, say, 1% hit probability. Maybe that's 81 miles per hour, I don't know. And essentially equate all strikes to batted ball exit velocity of 81 miles an hour or 73 miles an hour, whatever it was. And again, I come at that from, you know, just thinking about it more practically than from a data science standpoint. And that was not well received by my professional colleagues, so we stopped and went down another path. It's happened to me many times in my career. So the independent variables that we used to basically create the explanatory model for the batted ball outcomes, for the exit velocity, were the release point, the pitch trajectory, so the release point, and then also the point it was at 23 feet, which essentially gives you models an implicit trajectory. The actual raw velocity, the effective velocity, which is the location-adjusted velocity, the movement, both the X and the Z axis, the location at where it crosses the plate at the X and the Z axis, the brake angle and the length of the brake, and also backspin and side spin of the pitches. So these are all pitch data. So we put all of that into a model, and that was essentially the independent variable. So the step one of this two-step process was to model exit velocity, batted ball outcome, off of those 7 or 8 variables. And that established us a baseline of how much of the variation in exit velocity could we explain with the pitch characteristics I just described. Step 2 was to take step 1 and layer onto it the previous pitch's data. So exit velocity of pitch 0 and exit velocity of pitch 0, all the traits of pitch 0, and adding to that the traits of pitch -1, essentially the previous pitch. And we looked at that in 2 forms. We looked at it in exactly the same form that the current pitch was modeled at, so the actual raw velocity, exit velocity, release points, and so forth. And then we looked at it as the delta. So the way we ended up specifying this in the end was that both higher explanatory power and I think we felt more comfortable with the point we were trying to get at is we have the data for the current pitch and then the change from the previous pitch. Those are the 2 variables, 2 groups of variables. So here's what we found. And again, these are the 4 combinations. We found that we were able to explain between 13 and 18% of the exit velocity of a batted ball based on all of the traits of the current pitch. 13 to 18% depend upon the handedness. That went up to 16 to 23% when we added the delta from the previous pitch. So the first row there, 4 percentage points, but 27% more explanatory power, 4 on 15, 4 essentially, and I rounded the 15 and 19, so the 27 is the actual percent increase, and so forth. So, so it added about a quarter to, to almost a third of additional explanatory power by adding the previous pitch. I don't know that is as revealing as I hoped it would be, but it does suggest that there's more to it than just what's going on in an individual pitch. And when we see, and I realize a lot of the data we see in the public domain today is very much shorthand, but we always have to be careful not to take it too literally. When we see the pitch value on, say, for example, Fangraphs for so-and-so's fastball, part of the credit for that goes to the pitch that was thrown before that. Or, said another way, perhaps the value of the fastball is diluted because it's in all different combinations, some of which don't have any setup value, if you will. So these are sort of the summary summary stats. What I then wanted to do was I wanted to look at which pitchers, because remember, I did this on a pitcher-by-pitcher basis, not hitter by hitter, so any given pitcher, but for all hitters that they faced of that handedness. And what I wanted to see was which pitchers were high on both of the scales and low on either of those scales. The scales meaning what was explaining their exit velocity of their pitches. Was it the current pitch, or was it the previous pitch, or was it in combination? So I thought a simple way to look at this and evaluate this and display this was through this simple 2x2 matrix, which basically has the current pitch on the vertical axis and the previous pitch on the horizontal axis. So what this implies is if you're in that top left box, it's really all about the current pitch. And you think of guys who just have nasty stuff, and maybe Mariano Rivera would have been a good example for this one, where you know what's coming. It's just, it's not really, there's not a mystery, and it doesn't matter as much what set it up, although, of course, Carlos Pena yesterday had an interesting case on that where it did matter. The bottom left means that there's something else that is going into determining what happens in exit velocity than any pitch characteristics. It's just there's not much explanatory power in the details of all those things I listed of each pitch. On the lower right, you could argue that it's really highly dependent on the previous pitch, and it's not even that dependent on the current pitch. And then the top right means that both have high explanatory power. So now let's look at some pitchers that fall into this. Remember, the data set was 12 to 18. So in the top left, you've got Zach Britton, Travis Wood, Sam Dyson, Joe Kelly, Sergio Romo, Ross Ohlendorf. Now, I would think Britton, Dyson, in particular, are two that stand out to me, and Romo probably. Those three stand out to me as guys who just have a pitch or two that are devastating in their own right. And yes, you could probably enhance them by setting them up, but it's not necessarily really a critical factor that's going to impact exit velocity. Now, I want to go back and remind you something, though. One of the big missing pieces of this is swings and misses or called strikes. So just because somebody is in one of these quadrants, it's not fully explaining the power of sequencing, because we excluded a very important and very desirable, from the pitcher's standpoint, outcome and aspiration of what he's trying to do with the pitch. So I want to caution you to look at all this through a very narrow lens and not make any broader implications from it. The lower left, I'm not sure I could explain why those are there. I mean, we know that Lester is an excellent tunneler, so I don't know why he would necessarily be in the lower left. Again, I suspect that a lot of the previous pitch value is getting him either freezing hitters and getting called strikes or getting swings and misses, neither of which are included in here, okay? So if you look at the spectrum of outcome from, 115-mile-hour home run to a swinging strike, what I've done is I've taken this part of the scale and measured it. I've really omitted the extreme hitter, this extreme pitcher success, which would be the swinging strike or the called strike. In the top right, you have an interesting group: Houston Street, Mark Burley, Broxton, Betances, Zepchinski, and Andrew Miller. So I thought that was a really interesting group, and I wanted to do, well, before I go to there, let's just look at the bottom names: Ottavino, Swarzak, Chad Green, Edwin Diaz, Cishek, and Guerin. That's saying that they really set hitters up one pitch out, basically, according to this. Again, to induce weak contact, at least. Now, on that top right, I wanted to dig a little deeper, so I went to Baseball Prospectus and got some tunneling data for those pitchers. So one of the things that I saw was with Houston Street, who, by the way, was almost in a class of his own. I mean, you saw the numbers on the previous page where we're explaining possibly like 20% of the variation with the first pitch and adding another 5 or 6 percentage points with the second pitch. Well, Houston Street was like 38% with the current pitch and 50% when you added the extra pitch. So he was high, like off the chart high. So I wanted to really understand him. He has 3 pitches that he hides extremely well, 3 pitch pairs that he hides extremely well or hide it, he's no longer pitching in tunnels. This plate to pre ratio is a way to look at pitch pairs and evaluate how well they're tunneled. So the plate to pre means if you look at the distance they are apart when they cross the plate relative to how close they were at this 23-foot mark when the batter is making his go, no-go decision, that's what this index means. The average for the league is 11.6, a plate to pre ratio. So the fastball change at 13.6, the change fastball in that order, in that sequence, at 13.5, and then the fastball slider at 12.2. Then I went to some of the other pitchers in that top right box, and you saw Jason Grilli with his fastball slider combination, really high deception, or at least a high diversion at the plate, given how close they were together when they were at the decision point of the hitter. Broxton, his slider fastball combination. Betances, and a lot of us, if you've watched Betances pitch, he'll throw that high fastball and then he'll bury the curve in the dirt that comes out that doesn't really have that much of a hump, so it's not that detectable because he throws the fastball up so he can hide the curve in it. He can't, that's not the curve he throws for a strike though, because that curve does have to pop up because he has so much 12-6 break on it. And then Andrew Miller with his slider and fastball. So I thought that was interesting. And so, a lot of this comes down to tunneling and the changes in exit velocity. Those were 2 of the variables in the second group of variables in my model, the delta from the previous pitch. Those were 2 of the variables that had some of the highest explanatory power. And I was thinking of this as more of an appendix, but where are we on time? Let me just, again, just to reprise this, I think you're aware of exit velocity, or I should say effective velocity. We've talked about it enough at this conference and talked about it yesterday, in fact. But basically, this just shows you that the contact point on home runs for a right-handed batter, if the ball's inside, you have to get to it sooner. So you have less response time. So effectively, the pitch is coming at you with a higher speed. It's not literally a higher speed, but effective velocity just integrates reaction time into raw velocity. The same thing can be said for the vertical dimension as well. You can see if pitches are, the home run pitches are higher, you have to get to them sooner than if they're lower. And again, the home run pitch is simply proxy for well-struck batted balls. So, and I think you might have seen this chart before. This is Perry Husband's chart. So this basically says a 90-mile-an-hour fastball is 90 miles an hour effective velocity if it's down the center of the plate where there's a 0, or if it's, and this is for a right-handed batter, pitcher's view. So the right-handed batter standing in where the words are on this page, right? And you're looking at it from the pitcher's side. So the diagonal that's away from you is basically neutral. So it's 90 high and away, it's 90 down and in, and it's 90 in the middle of the plate. However, if you move across the other diagonal, you see it can add as much as 4 or take away 4 effective velocity. So think of Noah Syndergaard. If Noah Syndergaard throws at even, let's say he's not putting all out and he throws at 98 up and in, and it's still in the strike zone, because if you go off the strike zone, it changes it even more. This is just within the strike zone. If he throws 98 up and in, it's really 102. And then if he throws a change down and away at even a hard change at 90, that's really 86. So that's a 16-mile-an-hour spread in the exit velocity just on his, if he uses them in the right locations. And you know, as Perry was saying yesterday and Carlos was saying yesterday, one of the things that happens is sometimes pitchers run into the bats. They literally, like if he does the opposite, he throws his, let's say, fastball down and away at 98, that's going to make that 94. And if he throws his hard change, let's say he hangs it and it's in and it's kind of up, that makes that almost the same effective velocity, which basically sets the hitter's, he's setting the hitter's timing clock and then running right into that on the next pitch. So anyway, I think I'll stop there and just, you know, save 5 minutes for any questions in case there are any. So thanks. Any suggestion? Yes. I said it was a pretty impure way to convert. I mean, it was sort of the duct tape approach. They didn't use those words, but that's what I sensed was the duct tape approach to baseball analytics, and you know, they weren't prepared to run with me on that. Yeah. Well, we did play around with that a little bit, because at one point we were looking at hit probability as our dependent variable, not just exit velocity, which would of course integrated launch angle and exit velocity. I can't remember some of the conclusions we found, but launch angle was definitely not more explainable by pitch characteristics. It was clearly less explainable on its own. So that's kind of where we stopped, because again, we were just trying to figure out if there was real explanatory power in that previous pitch. And by the way, some of the guys who were in that lower left corner, like a Lester, it might be that it's really a more complicated three-pitch sequence that, you know, that he lives on, or it could be that he's getting swinging strikes, as I said earlier. So, yes. Yeah, I mean, we looked at, and again, we also looked at this over the entire 7 years inclusive, right, 12 through 18. So we looked at, I think we said 75 balls in play with the previous pitch was the minimum that we were, you know what it was? It was 75 for, I believe, lefty on lefty, and then we had a higher threshold of 100 for all the other combinations. Just lefty on lefty, there's just so many less plate appearances. Yeah.
What about a hitter that's seeing that pitcher in that game for the second time?
Yeah. Yeah, that's, you know, I mean, if you look at, okay, so where would you go next with this? If you didn't hear the question, what about the hitter who's seeing a pitcher for the second time in that game? So I would sort of rank of to-dos on this in terms of importance is let's figure out how to integrate some metric that gives you both batted ball outcomes and other pitch outcomes like strikes or swinging strikes and so forth. So that would be the first thing I think I would have to fix or add. The second thing would be how do you simply go back within a plate appearance and get a broader sequence of pitches to see what impact they had. So maybe you would not use anything short of a third pitch ball in play or third pitch swinging strike so that you had two previous pitches to see the relative impact of those. And then I think the third thing I would add would be to go back to within a game, is there an experience factor? You know, where that, you know, because we're seeing third time through the lineup penalty, so, you know, there very well could be an experience factor, but it may not be detectable by looking at a string of pitches. It's more the integrated body of work that you've seen from that pitcher by the time you get to the sixth inning and face him for the third time. So it's going to be tougher to model because I don't think it would necessarily be as linear as what I'm trying to do. Yes?
A lot of times when we're watching games on TV, color analysts like to say when hitters foul the ball off themselves, the pitcher's probably go right back inside. If you look at this, effect of something similar to that.
No, it's an interesting question. You know, and you know, we were talking about, Carlos talked about this yesterday, right? Or I don't know if it was a conversation I was having with him or what he said when he was up here, but he said, you know, a lot of times when a pitcher is, yeah, it was. He was talking about the Kershaw-Woodruff at bat. When a pitcher sees, you know, a foul ball, he may be thinking, okay, I've virtually got him, and the hitter's probably thinking, well, I virtually got him too. So it's a little bit of a chess match there. We did not examine that though. No. Okay, I think we're at the end of our time. Thanks very much. And Alan Nathan is going to be coming up.